You know, there's a lot that can be said about this console. The NES is one of the greatest consoles of all time, and today we're going to take a little bit of a closer look at it. What I'm holding here today is an original, well, not an original, but an NES Classic Edition. This one is the legit copy, and this one is a Chinese knockoff. It's pretty crazy. They look identical. A conversation for another day. But I wanted to have this video, sort of a new segment on my channel. Over the next few weeks, I'm going to be covering my experiences with all of the retro consoles, starting with the NES Classic, the NES, and we'll work our way up to the modern day. So there's a lot to be said about the NES. I don't want to make the video too long-winded, but there is a lot to cover. So what was my introduction with the NES? So when I was growing up, keep in mind I was born in '83, and actually one other thing I want to mention before we get too far into this video, a lot of the stuff you're going to hear today is real world, legit information. A lot of this stuff you're going to hear today, you never hear the other channels talk about. I've never heard MJR, Hancock. A lot of the older guys haven't talked about it. And then you've got a lot of the younger generation that covers the NES, but they weren't even born back then to even really understand how it was. So that's part of the reason for this video, is I want to tell you guys a lot of stuff that, again, it's a lot of misconceptions out there. People don't really tell the true story. So again, let's get into it. So growing up, I was born in '83. Again, you can imagine by the time I was 4 years old, it was 1987. 1988, me and my family, we were living in Niagara Falls, and I remember one day in late 1988, our parents bought us a Nintendo Entertainment System, and man, up until that time, the only time I had experienced it was I went over to a buddy of mine, again, we were like 4 years old at the time. I went over to his house. His name was Akbar. I can remember the guy's name, Akbar Ali. And he had blades of steel, and we would go into his basement during the summer, and that's all we would do. Again, I was 4 or 5 years old. You're playing blades of steel. We weren't playing Mario. We were playing blades of steel. It was just an absolute incredible time to be growing up as a child. So later on in 1988, my parents actually bought us a Nintendo Entertainment System, and it came with Mario and Duck Hunt, right? Well, my parents actually bought another game that came along with it, and that was the original Metroid. Now, again, you don't hear about this nowadays, but when that game came out, when Metroid came out, it was a sleeper. Nobody was really talking about it. It wasn't a big franchise. It was just another game released on the Nintendo Entertainment System. It wasn't a big deal. It was such a polarizing game. Here you have, a lot of us are so used to the generic platformers like Mario, and then you have a game like Metroid where it's just busted wide open. I mean, there was no internet back then, so we have no idea how to explore this world. There's so much going on. I was subscribed to Nintendo Power, so I can remember one day my sister put in the password Justin Bailey. And those of you who know what I'm talking about, you put that password in, and it starts the game off in a different area, and you're basically Samus without her helmet on. It was just like the biggest deal, because up until then, there was no such thing as a female protagonist, and Nintendo didn't really come forward and really state the gender of Samus. So for us to see that, it was really crazy to see that in 1988. And the game had the passwords, obviously. There's no save states. These are the days of very long passwords. So we had those two games, well, 3 including Duck Hunt. And then around the same time, 1988, we would take trips over to my aunt's place, and she had her sons living with her at the time. They must have been in their 30s. And, they weren't working for a living. I don't really know their whole story. But my one cousin, Vernon, who I haven't seen since that time, he had an NES, and he had a nice chunk of games. And I'm talking, he had the heavy hitters. He had Zelda, he had Platoon, which, again, if you were growing up back then, you weren't exposed to all this. You know, you see a game like Platoon, never mind the movie, but just the game, you see the guy crawling on the ground. At that time, it was considered almost 3D. It was a big deal. He had Tetris. Like, it was just like, wow, the colors, the graphics, it was insane. I couldn't get enough of it. So, I want to say about 1990, the movie The Wizard came out. And obviously that was a big unveil, Super Mario Brothers 3. And man, I remember going to the bus stop as a kid in 1990, and one of the kids at the bus stop said to me, "You're not going to believe it, I got Super Mario Brothers 3 last night," and fuck, it blew my mind. Again, back in the day, brand new NES game was as much as it is now for a game. It was like, in Canadian funds, it was like $79.99. Like, it was expensive as hell. And so this is where it gets interesting. My parents eventually bought us Super Mario Brothers 3, and man, like, at that point, that was the greatest game ever. There was nothing that ever came close to that. But I want to just emphasize, when Super Mario Brothers 3 came out, and nobody's going to tell you this nowadays, back then, nobody really had Super Mario Brothers 2. It just really wasn't a game that caught on at the time. Everybody obviously had Super Mario Brothers 1, and then 2 came out around 87, I think. Nobody really jumped out and bought that one. But when Super Mario Brothers 3 came out, that was a big freaking deal. Everybody and their mother had that game. It was just like the Tanuki suit, Big World, Pipe World, the Sand World where the sun would chase you. Like, it was just unbelievable. It was like, fuck all the other games. We're just going to play Super Mario Brothers 3. So, such a big deal. And then my dad bought NES Open Golf. And man, me and my dad used to play that all the time in the basement. NES Open. And then I got RC Pro-Am Racing. I used to play that all the time. TNC Surf Designs, another one I used to play all the time. Wood and Water Rage. So there's just a lot of great games, a lot of great memories. And even when the Genesis came out, in the early 90s, the NES was still hot. It was extremely hot. Most people still had the NES. And obviously, in the early 90s, the Genesis took off. And a lot of people graduated from the NES to the Genesis. But, like I said, the NES, a lot of people won't tell you this, the NES was still pretty hot up until 94, 95. It was hot. And a lot of the games I was able to pick up after the 90s and the early 2000s. I had sold the NES long after, in the mid-90s when I eventually got a Super NES. But in the late 90s, early 2000s, I reacquired a lot of my NES games. And the thing is with collecting the NES, believe it or not, up until 2004, 2005, these games were dirt cheap. You could go into the pawn shop and they would have a huge crate full of NES games, and they were all $5 to $10. I kid you not. I know you guys think it's crazy. So I'm going to go through the list of games that I had. I may have missed a couple, but for the most part, these are the games that I had. There were 716 games that came out on the NES. 679 of them were released in North America. So I had Blades of Steel, David Crane's A Boy and His Blob, which was an amazing game, Donkey Kong Classics, Dr. Mario, Final Fantasy, Friday the 13th, Galaga, The Immortal, I know, The Legend of Zelda, The Legend of Zelda 2, Maniac Mansion, Mega Man 2, Mike Tyson's Punch-Out, NES Open Golf, Pro Wrestling, RC Pro-Am Racing, River City Ransom, Lunar Pool, again, TNC Surf Designs, Wood and Water Rage, Super Mario Brothers 1, 2, and 3, Tetris, Willow, Metroid, and it was with the black box edition. It wasn't the other one that you could get that had the yellow cover. Codename Viper, an extremely underrated Capcom game. Go-Go 13, and I also had I had another one too. It was one of those carts where there was like 50 games in one. Most of the games were shitty. But yeah, no, you can see I had a pretty good collection. I had a legit collection, and around 2007, I put it on Kijiji for $200, and some guy came from Ottawa down to where I was living at the time and bought it. Had I known, right? I had the Power Glove. I had obviously 2 controllers. The light gun that was the original with the orange. Or sorry, not the orange. It was just completely gray. I think I got that right. Yeah, it was completely gray. After a while, they changed it to orange. So I had an original NES. But yeah, a few things on this list as well I want to mention. Let me see here. Legend of Zelda. So that's another one. Everybody talks about how the second one is garbage. Okay, when that game came out, I think it was around 80, 88, 89. The Legend of Zelda 2, that was a big effing deal. More people were playing that than the original Legend of Zelda. Legend of Zelda 2 was just so amazing at the time. You had this open world where you'd walk around the map, and then when you went into the villages, it was side-scrolling. Again, people harp on that game now, and they cut it up, and they say it's no good. But I'm telling you, back in 1991, 92, we were all playing that game. It was amazing. What else do we have here? Mega Man 2. I, like a lot of other people growing up, nobody bought Mega Man the original. When Mega Man 2 came out, I don't know what the deal was, but we all had it. It was amazing. What else do we have here? River City Ransom. I'm sure that's an expensive game now. It's one of the better beat-em-ups on the console. Willow is absolutely amazing. It's just like Zelda. Mike Tyson's Punch-Out, another one. They re-released it after he got convicted of rape as just Punch-Out. I, back then, didn't know anybody that had that version of Punch-Out, because at that point, we all had Mike Tyson's Punch-Out. So when they re-released it, I would have to imagine that's the more uncommon variation of that cart. So yeah, it's just, a lot of amazing games. I'm not even scratching the surface here. There's so many games to talk about on this console. But yeah, so when I had the NES, obviously it was extremely hot. Then the Genesis comes out in the early 90s, and my dad was working at Kmart at the time, and I walked into the back stock room, and they had a Genesis hooked up. And in 1991-92, to be able to see Sonic the Hedgehog for the very first time, the graphics and the audio and the speed of Sonic was something to behold. As soon as I saw that, obviously I was like 9 years old. I'm like, okay, fuck the NES. I need a Genesis, and I want a Genesis really bad. And I remember around 1993, 94, for Christmas, all I wanted was a Genesis. Go downstairs for Christmas, and I open it up, and what do I get? I get a Super NES. I'm fucking pissed. I'm sure my parents weren't too thrilled. Again, at this point in 1993, the Super NES had been out for about a year in North America, and I'm telling you, again, none of these channels will tell you this. It was not a big deal when the Super NES came out at the time. Nobody bought it. Everybody wanted a Genesis. Yeah, it had Super Mario World, and A Link to the Past that came out. I'm telling you, nobody gave two shits. People were still on the hype train with the Sega Genesis. So, yeah, I got the Super NES in 1993, and the rest was history. 94, 95, 96, 97, focusing more on the Super NES. Our family still had the NES, but we kind of kept it in the basement. And me and my dad would go downstairs every so often, and we'd play NES Open. And yeah, it was a really good console. It's probably, well, not probably, it is one of the best consoles of all time. If you are one of the lucky ones that were able to go out and get one of these, this is just a sample size. There's 30 games in here, but it's missing a lot. It has a lot of good ones, but it's missing a lot. But like I said, if you didn't grow up back then, it's easy for people to, spew things out there on these channels and talk about the NES, but like I said, it was a big deal. It was a huge influence for me and my family, and all I can say is when the Super NES first came out, a lot of us were still playing the NES. That's how important it was to us. Looking back on it now, obviously, A lot of the big franchises that are still growing strong today made their mark on the NES. And yeah, obviously you got the more expensive games out there, like the Little Samsons. I'm telling you, back in the day, I can remember walking right into Blockbuster Video and seeing Little Samson. I remember seeing that game in the bargain bin. It wasn't a big deal. A lot of the prices, like I said, are inflated, unfortunately. It's really hard for collectors. So that's why it is good to have an NES Classic. It's a little bit more realistic for us to obtain and play these great games. So that's pretty much my history with the NES. I know I've probably missed a lot of stuff, but I just wanted to give you my 2 cents on it. And like I said, guys, if you guys are the younger generation and you didn't grow up with the NES, give it a chance. There's a lot of holy grail games, a lot of hidden gems on this console, and you won't be disappointed. So that's gonna do it for this edition of my retro experience. Next time around, we're gonna visit the Super NES. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Take care.